Welcome back to another episode. Today we're talking about beyond narcissism and understanding the full spectrum of abuse, and especially male abusers. And with me today is an abuser intervention specialist, Lundy Bancroft. Now, you guys know we've talked about this so much. It's such a painful and confusing experience when the person that you love, that you committed the rest of your life to, starts showing up in ways that aren't loving. And over the course of years or decades, the severe emotional impact that has. And yet in today's society, everyone seems to put the label narcissist on that. And so I'm hoping that today's conversation really highlights what is that playbook of an abuser, and where does narcissism come in, and what's the danger of calling everyone a narcissist? And so before I bring on Lundy, let me just tell you a little bit about him. He's a leading expert on abusive men and the family court system. So we'll be talking about that as well. And with over 3 decades experience, Lundy has worked directly with thousands of abusers and has trained countless professionals in identifying and addressing patterns of abuse. And he shares his insights in his groundbreaking books, including Why Does He Do That? And The Batterer as Parent. So you can read more about Lundy in the show notes and about the details of our episode. But with no further ado, welcome, Lundy.
And I look forward to this conversation because it's a particularly important time in life when you have abuse dynamics and then suddenly you're dealing with it in the midst of a divorce. And that's a very, very loaded time.
Yeah. And the court system is so broken. So many of my clients feel like they're abused at home and then they go to court and it feels like just another level of pain and abuse. And so let's start at the beginning. First of all, Lundy, if I could just ask you, I have each guest share something about themselves outside of their work. And so my question to you is, what are you most proud of in your life?
The main activity that I have outside of my work life is helping people learn how to do a personal healing method called co-counseling. That's a peer method, so you don't have to spend money on it. You might spend money on a training to learn how to do it, but after that, it doesn't cost you anything. You just meet up with other people who've had the training, and you actually can get to a pretty high level of skill. When people hear co-counseling, they tend to think peer counseling, and they tend to assume, oh, that's going to be like a very low level of skill, like you just listen. But we're actually training people to be quite skilled counselors for each other, but in this way that's outside of the professional realm, which means that there's access to everyone. You don't have to worry about, well, do I have money for this or do I have insurance for this? And we also, I think, have developed some particularly powerful techniques. So that's what I'm most proud of, is my role in helping people learn how to co-counsel and spreading that practice. I've started to write about it, and I've started to do much more teaching about it as I work less than I used to in domestic violence.
Yeah, well, that's beautiful. And let's get a link from you that we put in the show notes so that if people are particularly curious. What a beautiful answer. But if you have anything that people can kind of look at, I'd love to have that in the show notes for them.
I'd be happy to share that. We've formed an organization called the Peak Living Network that's devoted largely to teaching and spreading co-counseling, and it's almost entirely free. So
Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, so just out of curiosity, how did you get so deep into the world of male abusers?
well, I came out of college with a fairly useless degree from a employment standpoint, and my interest was in counseling. But I was really interested in counseling less as a social work kind of direction and more in a kind of like justice or social change kind of direction. And I didn't know if anything like that existed. But I was looking around for a couple of years, and then I learned about abuser programs. And I thought, well, that's a way to confront the societal mistreatment of women, but using counseling skills in order to do that. And it ended up being a perfect fit for me because there was this sense of doing counseling work while simultaneously feeling like I got to be part of a cause to fight domestic abuse and to fight violence against women in general. So it's been a very satisfying role to play. I was in the field of domestic abuse prevention for about 30 years. I'm now semi-retired from it, but it's been a really terrific thing to be part of.
It just sounds like what an incredible way to help heal the world.
That's how it felt. Yeah.
Yeah. So when I was reading your biography, you've worked with so many abusers. Now, like my audience, I probably have like a little cognizant dissonance here because it's like when you think of a narcissist, right? Like they don't really respond very well to direction because they're not wrong. And yet you've spent God knows how many hours supporting abusers. So can you share a little bit about what that work looks like and maybe even the difference between the person who would take direction and the person who can't or won't?
So the first point for people to understand is that abusers don't believe on any deep level that there's anything wrong with what they're doing. That's one of the reasons it's so easy to mistake them for narcissists. And so they don't come to an abuser program out of a sense of guilt or shame about what they're doing. They come there because they're under very heavy pressure to be there. And sometimes they're under heavy pressure from the woman who has left him or is threatening to leave him, and he can tell she's actually really serious about it this time. Or maybe she has left him and is now back with him, but by leaving him for a while, she demonstrated that she's able to do that. And so he has to take that warning more seriously. A lot of times they've already split up, and he's hoping that if he gets some counseling, he'll be able to get back with her. And then I would say a larger proportion nowadays than that come ordered by a court because they've been prosecuted and convicted of a domestic abuse related offense, either an actual assault or a violation of a protective order. So someone has to be making him be there. And so their motivation to change at the beginning is very low. But over time, they often start to develop. I don't know if I should say often, that might be too strong a word, but they sometimes start to develop some motivation to change and actually do the work. It's very hard work because it involves having to look seriously at behaviors that they've done that have been very, very destructive, that have caused a lot of pain and suffering and psychological harm to other people, the women in their lives and the children in their lives. And nobody wants to look at having done that kind of damage. And so that's a very hard process for them. And a lot of what drives the abuser is what we talk about in the field is a sense of entitlement. He really believes he has the right to rule the roost. He really believes he has the right to have everything catered for him. And so he's really aggravated that we're demanding that he change. He's aggravated that the court system is demanding that he change if he's involved with the court system. He feels like everybody's being unfair to him. He feels like, oh, if you just realized how awful this woman was, you'd know why I had to call her those horrible names or why I had to put her in fear. And so the abusers that, in our experience, make the biggest changes are, first of all, the ones where they've received criticism in their lives about their treatment of women from people beyond just the court and the abuser program. They say their own friends and relatives have said, you need to stop treating your girlfriends and wives this way. Or friends of theirs actually said, no, we're not going to go along with you while you're behaving that way towards your partner. Or sometimes sometimes their workplace is coming down on them for domestic abuse perpetration. They're getting criticized from multiple sources. That starts to make a difference. And so that's one factor we find in which guys really change. The guys who have suffered more direct personal losses as a result of their own behavior. Serious prosecution is a motivator, and the loss of a relationship, particularly a relationship they were really invested in, or if this is the second or third relationship that they've lost where the woman has named for them, I'm leaving you because you're abusive, that becomes a motivator. And then, of course, it matters whether he's personality disordered or not, because we do have a percentage of abusers who also have personality disorders, and most commonly narcissistic or antisocial. And those guys, even in an excellent abuser program, are very unlikely to make any kind of significant changes for all the reasons of what you've referred to, of what we know about those folks. What's confusing for people, or one of the many things that's confusing for people, is that abusive behavior by men towards women, which is my area, that's the only area I can talk about. I can say little things about other dynamics and other situations, but to really speak from extensive experience and extensive knowledge of the research, I have to be talking about male perpetrator with female victim. He's driven primarily by cultural training. And I don't mean within only a certain culture, but I mean societal training, what his key surroundings have been growing up and what his key influences have been growing up, including media influences. And sadly, and this is a painful thing for people to face, but sadly, there is so much societal support to this day for male abuse of women. It's changing, but it just hasn't changed nearly as much as people would like to believe. That you unfortunately do not have to have a personality disorder to behave in these ways. And so, a kind of short version that I tell people is, in order to behave in destructive ways that your society seriously condemns, you have to have mental health problems. But in order to behave in a really destructive way that your society largely approves of and lets you get away with, you don't have to have mental health problems. Like if you grow up in a country where everybody abuses alcohol, you're likely to end up abusing alcohol, even if you don't have any particular reason, psychological reason for being vulnerable to addiction. And so if you grew up in a society like the United States that has very high levels, above average levels of violence against women, and has from the beginning, you don't have to, unfortunately, to have something seriously wrong with you from a mental health standpoint to become a very, very mean and destructive to female partners, depending on who you grew up around and what they taught you about how you had the right to behave or even the obligation to behave.
So I just want to slow this down a little bit. So when you
That's
talk
great.
about society training, I'm hearing the first thing you say is like in our country, there's such a propensity of it. So it's more common, just like drinking would be more common in a particular culture. And then I immediately think, well, I'm in my 60s. Television has certainly changed a lot. But can you give a couple of different examples of the uniqueness in our American society that perpetuates this so much?
Well, television, great example actually, because one thing you hear from indigenous communities in North America is that domestic abuse was unheard of or close to unheard of in their communities until television came. So that's a very, very strong shaper of societal norms. But the United States is also an exceptionally violent country overall. And one of the things we know from research, from research comparing different countries, is that if you have a high level of overall violence, that's also going to increase your level of male violence against women. Then other factors that we have in the United States, and I don't mean to say, by the way, that the United States is one of the worst countries in the world. There are countries with higher levels of violence against women per capita than the United States, but people assume that we're on the low end, and we're actually above average. We're not way, way above average, but we are above average by international statistics. The I think there's just a very long history here, as there is in many countries, of religious systems that insist that women be subservient. There's a long tradition in this country of women making far, far less money than men, and that really affects women's independence and therefore their ability to escape control when they want to escape control. Huge denial in this country about the level of sexual violence happening to women and to kids, both boys and girls. So I think we have a lot of factors. Even though I was trained as a sociologist, I can't really speak as that knowledgeable a sociologist anymore. But what we deal with in abuser programs is, what are the excuses that our clients are giving us? And the excuses that our clients are giving us tell us a lot about where did they learn that these things were acceptable behaviors. And so then that tells us a lot about societal conditioning. So often guys are telling us, well, I always learned growing up, or the Bible said such and such, or everybody knows that such and such is acceptable. And my uncle was like this, and my grandfather was like this, and my dad was like this. So I know it's all over the place in his family tree. And we notice a lot from our work with abusers that some of them just come from families where the abuse of women runs right through the family tree and for generations. And some of them come from towns where it's just all over town. And it does not divide by class or race. People think, oh, they must come from a lower income town or a less educated town. That's not what we have found. It's like each town, each city seems to have its own culture. And I've had clients from very privileged towns where it turned out that was one of those towns where the domestic violence is just rampant in that town.
Yeah, I think people see like a big, beautiful house, and it's like there could be hell happening behind that front door. It's you don't have to be in a trailer park to be exposed to that.
Unfortunately, that's true. And actually, in some ways, it's easier for the wealthier abuser to hide it because
Yeah.
people are less likely to see and hear. And they're also assume, oh, it wouldn't be him. If people are interested in that subject, by the way, there's a really useful book called Not to People Like Us that's specifically about upscale domestic violence. And I'm blanking on the author's name at the moment, but Not to People Like Us.
I'll put that's in the show notes too, folks. Beautiful. Okay, just a personal question here. You've been doing this for how many years?
So a little more than 30. That's why I'm fading out a little bit.
Yeah. And what is your takeaway? What's the progress or the lack of progress you've seen? Are you hopeful? What are you noticing?
I'm hopeful. I think one of my takeaways is that the media and other key aspects of our society seem to only want to look at a problem for so long at a time, and then they want to move on to something else. And so we have a very serious problem with racism in this country, but the media thinks, oh, well, we did that a few decades ago, and that problem's been solved. It's like, actually, no, it hasn't even changed significantly for the better. So there have been periods in time when domestic violence was a big thing in the news and was getting a lot of coverage, and now it's like, oh, that's old news. It still comes up sometimes in particular situations, but I think the media attention span is part of the problem because we've had periods of making really great gains in expanding women's ability to get free from abuse. And now, unfortunately, currently we're in a period of retrenchment where some of those gains are slipping away. And I guess the other real takeaway I have is that you have to have a lot of kind of activist energy, troublemaking energy. And if you get too polite, you start to lose your gains. And the domestic violence world has become, in my opinion, too polite. It's become a respected part of the system, gets a fair amount of funding, not enough, but a fair amount of funding. And as a result, I think has gotten too comfortable and quiet. And that's why now some of the gains that abused women made legally and culturally are starting to slip.
Right, right. So let's go to this conversation about labeling all abusers as narcissists. And I was reading an article of yours this morning where you kind of raised the danger of doing that, almost like naming the wrong problem and then therefore not being able to solve it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I'll make a few points, particularly the things that I think have kind of the greatest practical implications. So one is that if you believe a man is a narcissist, then you're going to believe that what he needs is intensive therapy. You're also going to know, of course, that regular talk therapy is not, if you're not going to work. If you're really up on personality disorder, you know that regular talk therapy won't work. And he's going to need something on the level of what's called dialectical behavioral therapy, that was created by Marsha Linehan, which is really one of the only interventions that's found to be effective for people with personality disorder. And it's very intensive. It's twice a week. It's a very long, it's a powerful and often successful program, but there's a lot to it. And whereas if you think of him as being primarily a product of bad attitudes, of entitled, contemptuous, and sometimes misogynist attitudes, you're going to think, well, what he needs is consequences. And that's going to become much more your focus, is the imposing of consequences. And there's a really extensive body of research showing that if you fail to impose adequate consequences on the domestic abuse perpetrator, you don't get changes in his behavior. And these have been summarized at length. I can give you the citations to two really important books by a researcher and writer named Edward Gondorf, who not only writes in his books about his own research, but summarizes dozens of other studies in his books and shows what happens when you try to treat domestic violence perpetration as a mental health problem and how badly that turns out, how unsuccessful it is, and why it would be a mistake to decide, oh, abusers are narcissists and we're going to try to treat this as narcissism. And what happens when you fail to impose adequate consequences. And one thing that you hear a lot when you watch debates about this is, oh, those abuser programs are only focused on one type of abuser. Well, that's not true at all. And Gondorf's research shows that regardless of the quote type or style of abuser, whether he's considered a milder abuser or a more severe abuser, or he's considered a more depressed abuser or a more charismatic abuser, that counseling outcomes tend to come out about the same. And that, I mean, abuse intervention, different ways of doing the abuse work, I'm not talking now about therapy, tend to come out about the same. And that what tends to work best is a program that mixes education of the client with confrontation of the client. They need to be called out repeatedly on their whole history of damaging behavior. And any program that's not adequately challenging and confronting them to look at what they've done and constructively criticizing them for what they've done is not going to accomplish anything in bringing about change. And the other issue that's so crucial to me is that because personality disorder seems to largely have its roots in early and severe childhood psychological injury, when you're focused on personality disorder, you're going to be tending to blame individuals in this man's life for why he came out that way. And I'm very concerned, as someone who's been fighting violence against women for my entire career, about how easily that's going to lend itself to putting the blame back on women, namely the mothers. And we found that our personality disordered clients were something like 1 in 6 or 1 in 8. They were a small minority. Even among really severe abusers, they mostly were not personality disordered. They're misdiagnosed, either professionally or often they've been misdiagnosed by people.
Right.
Because their behavior pattern in relationship looks so much like personality disorder behavior. But as I've written about in my articles, there's so many ways that it does not fit, and it's consistently limited to their relationships to intimate partners and former intimate partners. And yes, those circumstances are particularly likely to reveal someone's mental health problems, but no one is able to confine their mental health problems only to their intimate relationships. You can't do it if you have a serious mental health problem. You may be able.
So that I want to highlight that. So what you're saying here is a tell is if the behavior is specifically in your romantic or intimate relationships, but they're different at work, they're different on the ball field, they're different hanging out with their friends, and those same behaviors don't come up, it doesn't make sense that it would be a personality disorder because you can't turn it on and off that way.
Right. I have to say one caveat to that, which is that people with personality disorders can hide it for certain periods of time because they often have worked very hard to develop these charismatic and manipulative skills. But they can't hide it endlessly. If you've worked with this person for 4 years, you start to know that there's a problem there, particularly if they've been in any position where they have to hear feedback, where they have to hear criticism and improve what they're doing. If you've dealt with this person as a close friend or a relative for a substantial length of time, you're detecting anytime that you've been in serious conflict with the person, you've discovered that there's a problem there because people with personality disorder can't do a serious conflict without starting to behave in really inappropriate ways. So yes,
whereas an abuser can do a serious conflict.
Outside of his intimate partner relationships, he can. You've got abusers who have female bosses that they've responded to reasonably respectfully for years, have accepted criticism from that woman. There are abusers who are misogynists, but one of the misconceptions about abusers is that they're all misogynists. It's not. This is one of the things we were struck so much by in the field, is what an oddly compartmentalized problem it is, and how much it has to do with what his training is about what a woman in an intimate partner relationship must do for him, and what he has the right to do to punish her. In other words, to enforce those things that she's supposed to do for him if she's, in his eyes, failing to do them.
And again, just to bring back what you said in the beginning, and he's developing that way of seeing the world based on TV, based on being in a violent society, based on society kind of allowing or it being so prevalent certain abuses toward women. And so this is the paradigm that he's growing up in or what he's seeing, and therefore just taking on as this is realistic. This is a reasonable perspective on life and relationship.
Unfortunately so. And as I say, that really comes out in the excuses that he gives, how he uses religion as an excuse, how he uses his relatives as an excuse, how often he says, well, everybody knows that, blah, de blah, as his excuse, which shows that he's been hearing this all over the place
Right.
throughout his life. And then there's also some research showing that their social circle, particularly during their teen years, is very, very influential in how they then end up treating women in relationships. So that when you talk about cultural or societal influence, their peer influences as teens turn out to be quite important.
Right, right. All right, we're going to take a quick sponsor break here. And when we come back, I would love to pivot a little bit to family court and what happens there with all of this. Of course, your friends and loved ones.
Of course, your friends and loved ones.
But if
care
you're
deeply
honest,
about
well, they
you.
mean well.
But if you're
when it
honest,
comes to your
well, they
divorce,
mean well.
they just
When it
don't get
comes to
it.
your
And
divorce,
sometimes you
they
leave those
just don't get it.
conversations
And
feeling
sometimes you
even
leave those
more
conversations
isolated.
feeling even more
If you're feeling
isolated.
lonely and
If you're
craving
lonely and
connection,
craving
support,
connection,
and
support
practical
and
guidance,
practical guidance,
our
check out
high
our
conflict divorce support group is
group,
open
where
and
we gather
accepting rolling
regularly from the
enrollments.
comfort of our homes.
Facilitated by Karen
by
McMahon, you join
McMahon,
from
you
the
will
comfort of
feel
your home
heard,
and feel
seen,
heard,
encouraged,
seen, encouraged, and powerfully guided in the emotional and practical steps ahead.
Go to
jbddivorcesupport.com/HCDSG and join
and
us
register
today. Are you looking for a way to make co-parenting easier? Talking Parents can help you streamline your shared parenting responsibilities and minimize conflict by keeping all interactions organized and documented. With Talking Parents, you can stop worrying about the he said, she said, and focus on what really matters most, your children. Go to www.talkingparents.com/JBD to start a 30-day free trial today. Divorce feels like an overwhelming perfect storm as you navigate pain, fear, and confusion while struggling with unfamiliar legal procedures and the pressure to make complex decisions that will impact the rest of your life. Our free Rapid Relief Call provides the clarity and confidence you're yearning for. Visit rapidreliefcall.com for support and guidance today. So, here we've got an entire audience of people who are struggling with some level of abuse from their spouse, and they're going to family court, and family court is not terribly well equipped. Can we talk a little bit about that?
30 years ago, or especially 40 years ago, even before my time in the field, nobody, well, that's an exaggeration, but very little was there any talk about domestic abuse. It was this big societal secret. You said very little about it. And with a whole set of societal changes that happened around the world, but I'm going to be talking particularly in the US. So in the US, it was heavily during the 60s and 70s. Domestic abuse started to get much more named and started to be a much more explicit reason for divorce. And the other thing that changed a lot in the beginning of the 1970s was that women who wanted to leave an abusive relationship started to have much more ability to do so. They started to have services available to them. They started to have protective orders available to them. They started to have friends that might actually understand what they were going through. A lot of things changed. By some time, I forget, I'd have to look back at the research, but by some time, maybe in the late 80s or early 90s, abuse was being given as one of the prime or perhaps the top reason for divorce. But so that means the family court needed to completely change the way it did business because suddenly abuse was such a heavy cause of why divorces were happening. It's because suddenly a lot of women were finding that they could leave. The court, unfortunately, nationally, and I think to some extent internationally, has, rather than realizing or accepting that it dramatically had to change how it does things, has decided to keep doing things the way it's always done them. And in other words, to treat marriage problems as being mutually caused, as needing mutual solutions, and seeing children as just like a possession that needs to be somehow divided fairly between the parents. Even though they always claim that they're doing what's in the best interest of the child, they really are still cutting a child up typically like a loaf of bread.
Yes.
And then, unfortunately, there have been a group of people working in alliance with the family courts, particularly psychologists, that have developed a set of theories that essentially made excuses, allowances for the ways of thinking, in other words, about abuse cases that made excuses for the court to keep doing what it's always done. And particularly, we have a theorist who's written so much and became the darling of the family courts called Janet Johnston, who had just created a whole set of articles for why to dismiss, reasons to dismiss domestic violence allegations and sexual abuse allegations without proper investigation, child sexual abuse allegations, including she continued to promote Freudian beliefs about children's sexual attractions to their parents and things like that. And she became the darling of the family courts. And one other thing I'll say, I mean, I have to be careful because I get started on this subject, you might never get me stopped. But one thing I'll say is that I can't think of any other profession, there may be others, but I'm just saying I can't think of others outside of family law, where the worse you do your job, the more money you make.
Yeah.
Because if conflicts are quickly resolved, you don't make any real money off them. And so if people are really well represented, and if people who have chronic histories of inappropriate, destructive behaviors towards their partners or towards the children are quickly stopped and told, you can't keep doing that. If you want to have this relationship with your children, this has to stop. We're going to monitor you carefully to see that it stops. And if it's not stopping, you're going to get very little time with your kids. Well, that'll rapidly resolve problems where there's abuse. And my clients and caused way less trouble to their victims during divorce back when I first started in the field because they didn't know they could yet.
So you're about to describe your view of how broken the court system is and how it has emboldened and weaponized even the abuser?
Exactly. So beginning in the 1980s and then taking off in the 1990s, the domestic abuser discovered that the family court was a wide open field for him. He was not going to be held accountable. His excuses were going to be bought. His negative ways of talking about the victim, which abusers specialize in, were going to be just rampantly believed, while her reports about his behavior were going to be rampantly not believed. He discovered like it was his, wow, this area totally plays.
His ball field,
This
yeah.
is my ball field. This is my ball field. And this has been the most painful aspect of my career because, as we were talking about earlier, I've seen some things happen during my years in the field that have been encouraging. I've seen quite a number of things happen during my years in the field that have been encouraging. Family law processes have gotten worse and worse for mothers over that period. And let me say here, by the way, something that I think is very important, which I hope men in the audience will hear, which is, if you're being mistreated in the family court as a dad, I really encourage you to bond with moms that have been mistreated by the family court rather than joining and speaking negatively about them. Because one of the things that's happened is that fathers who feel mistreated by the family courts are starting to speak terribly about mothers. And that just empowers the family court to keep doing what it's doing. If you really get what it feels like as a parent to be horribly treated, then your heart should go out to all these abused women who are having this experience, and you should form an alliance with them to demand family court reform. And for example, some of the family court kinds of reforms that I'm in favor of, any caring dad would be in favor of also. For example, a demand that family court processes become much more transparent because they're largely secretive, and a demand that there be caps placed on how much allied professionals can charge. Say a custody evaluator may only charge so much, and a so-called parent coordinator may only charge so much. I can send you a whole list of reforms that I've proposed that the court is refusing to do that would not only benefit moms, but would benefit any responsible caring dad who feels that he's not being heard in the court. And there are situations where the dad ends up being the one who's not being heard, particularly where the money is more on mom's side, because the court responds a lot, unfortunately, to where the money is. But I don't usually see the court jump on the dad with both feet. It can be very lousy to dads and fail to protect children from a mom who's a child abuser. And that can be awful for him. He still doesn't usually get jumped on with both feet. Like, I've yet to see a case where a dad was suddenly put on supervised visitation only for the offense of raising concerns about the mother's behavior. Now, he may feel that he's been put on supervised visitation unfairly, but I'm just saying I've never seen a guy, that was the reason he was put on was supervised visitation, was because he
Was raising concerns about the
he wouldn't stop. The court had ordered him to stop raising concerns, and he wouldn't stop doing it. Whereas I've now known several dozen women who ended up on supervised visitation because they won't shut up about their kids' deterioration.
It's such a heartbreaking situation. And I have one client, she's going into her 10th year, and she's got a 13 and 14-year-old, her 10th year in court. And the court system is so broken on so many different fronts. And like, you have such a keen understanding of the abuser and the background of it. And there seems to be so little requirement, especially when mental health issues and neurodiversity is so rampant. And yet everyone's got a legal background, but there's so little understanding of human beings outside of that, like your understanding.
It's really remarkable. And the family law system does not think of itself as having anything to do with the child protective system. They don't have that's not their mindset. Even though they always claim that we're focused on the best interests of the child, they don't actually have a protective mindset. They don't think, well, if a child is being abused, we should really take steps to do something about that. If a mom is being abused, or in the rare instances when we think a dad may be abused, we need to take steps to do something about that for the good of the children.
Right.
And by the way, I'll just say also that I don't believe somehow that women are good and men are bad. I think that the reason why abuse is overwhelmingly a male on female phenomenon has to do with who has the capability to create that kind of intimidation, and who has the ability to believe that they have a right to behave that way, and who can get away with it. And not because of some genetic thing or whatever, but it's very unusual for a woman to be able to literally put a man in fear. It's unusual for a woman to be able to cause a man to not be able to go to work because he's scared of how his wife is going to respond if he goes to work. It's not common that a woman can force a man to have all kinds of sexual contact that he does not want to have. You don't hear a lot of complaints from men about all this sexual contact that they didn't want.
Right.
And so I'm not trying to minimize anybody's injurious experience. I'm just trying to say there's some distinctions that really do matter at the level of really severe abuses of power, and what it means to have that kind of power over somebody, over another human being. But a woman can certainly abuse children, because there the power relationship goes in favor of the adult. And the court doesn't typically think of itself in that role of being a protector. But what that also means, unfortunately, is that when sometimes even quite caring judges will say, well, since I'm not a psychologist, I need to listen to what the psychologists have to say. And that's unfortunate. I really wish the judges would focus on what the evidence has to say. And
but do you feel that the psychologists who are in the court aren't necessarily communicating the right message? I want to understand. I don't want to misinterpret what you're saying.
They're very heavily focused on the belief that domestic violence perpetration is a psychological problem. So if they're not finding much evidence of testable psychological problem in the abuser, which, by the way, here's a place where people who are concerned about abuse and people who are concerned about personality disorder share interests, because psychological tests don't catch personality disorder very well either.
Right.
They don't catch abuse at all.
Right.
Abusiveness at all, but they don't catch personality disorder well. And the psychological testing really has no place in a divorce. Except as treatment, except to the extent that the judge wants to use it to require certain kinds of treatment for one of the parents. But the outcome of psychological testing should never have any impact on the parenting plan. That's totally inappropriate.
And yet I went through my divorce. We got a custody evaluation. Half of my clients, maybe significantly more than half, when they're concerned about their children, their option is to hire a psychological forensic and get that custody evaluation where they're evaluating mom and they're evaluating dad. And you're saying, and the whole point of this is to do what's best for the children. And yet it does seem that the overwhelming desire of the court is to just say 50-50 is best for the children. What is it about this psychological evaluation that you're saying it's bunk?
The first thing I will say is, find me a single research study that gives evidence of the connection between the outcome on any psychological test and how that person is performing as a parent. I have not been able to find a single study, and there should be, if it's a valid issue, there should be dozens or hundreds of studies. I can't find one study showing this, not theoretically, but showing from actual study, people who test this way, we're seeing these problems in how they parent their children.
And this is so important, this piece. You could be married to someone on the autistic spectrum, on the bipolar spectrum, on the borderline personality. So you could have, but that doesn't mean they don't have a right to parent. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily bad parents. So I want you to just connect the dots a little bit more here for the listener.
So I made a list, which I also would be happy to share with you, of the elements that go into what quality of parent you're going to be. And so there are questions of whether you're abusive or not, what your values are, what your ability is to own responsibility for your own actions, if your ability to identify and take responsibility for your own emotional issues, because we all have emotional issues, whether they rise to the level of what you would call a mental health problem or not. Some people with quite severe mental health problems are very good parents. Why? Because they own that they've got serious mental health problems and they take steps to protect their children from that. I knew a woman pretty well because her daughter was a friend of my daughter's who would actually end up a couple times a year having to be psychiatrically hospitalized. And what I noticed about her that really stood out for me is what excellent judgment she used about who her daughter was with during her hospitalizations. She would pick really smart, good, because there were reasons why I would get to know who her daughter had ended up with during those periods. It could have counted way against her that she had mental health problems if she was divorcing an abuser, where the abuser would have been a much greater risk to those children. And she was a very responsible parent. People had raised very few issues about her parenting, but she went through a lot psychologically. She had quite a well kid.
So here we're spending, I just had a client say $20 to $30,000 for their custody evaluation. And you're saying there's actually no research and data that's going to, and not that the courts are doing anything with that data, even if it comes back saying someone has a problem, it still leans so heavily toward 50-50. But is your advice like, be cautious about?
I believe the psych eval its only acceptable purpose in a divorce is for treatment planning for the person who took that evaluation, not for anything about what the parenting plan should look like. And there's also no evidence that mental health is somehow an outstanding factor. I'm saying there's so little evidence that it's strongly linked at all. But I think common sense tells us mental health is going to be a factor in what quality of parent you are. I'm not trying to suggest that it's not at all, even though the research isn't really there. But there's no common sense or research reason to believe that it's any stronger factor than all these other things I've listed off. And so why is it being elevated to that extent where, we're putting everything on that when someone's values are way more important? And whether someone's abusive or not is way more important. And whether someone's kind or not, like, how do you test whether someone's kind or not? That's what's going to matter most to kids. Is their parent kind? And does their parent respect their boundaries? If you've got a parent who's both kind and respects your boundaries, you're like way ahead of the pack just from those two things. And boundaries, does the family court know from boundaries? They never mention anything about boundaries. That's not even in their lexicon.
No, not at all.
So and again, this is a place where I feel like caring dads can really join forces with moms, because I think we actually could be demanding the same kinds of court reform.
100%. Yeah.
And the main thing is decisions should be being made on the basis of evidence. The other thing that we really need is appeals courts being much more willing to overturn what family law proceedings have decided. Appeals courts routinely overturn trial courts in criminal matters, and in other civil matters, they routinely overturn them. They so rarely overturn family court decisions. They just don't want to put that much time into even reviewing. They're not interested in appeals. And also most moms, at least, and I suspect even most caring dads don't have money for an appeal. And so family law judges know that they're rarely going to face appeals, and that's part of why they act with such impunity.
Okay, so let's get to the silver lining here, because as we wrap up, what I would love, Lundy, is for you to share with the listener some tips or strategies for what they can do when this that we've just talked about is their plight. And
So-
they are in the court system right now.
So one thing that I would say, and this is different from what I would have said 20 years ago, but this is from watching the outcomes over and over again, is if you can reach a settlement out of court, even one you don't really like, do it. Because what you're likely to get from the court's order is worse. And I'm not saying agree to things that are completely unacceptable to you, but I'm just saying try to swallow down a little bit on things that you really don't think are ideal for your kids, because they're likely to come out with something worse from court proceedings. And the abuser often doesn't realize that he would win even more if he fought. And so if you can get him to sign off. Just make sure you take that to court and get the judge to sign it, because abusers don't feel under any obligation to follow even their signed agreement. So make sure it becomes an order, that your agreement becomes an order of the court. But the other caution, and this is probably relates more to moms than to dads, is don't give away the store financially in order to keep custody. And I understand why you would want to do it. I would want to do it too. If you'd said, like, take my house, but leave me my kids, I would say, yes, take my house, leave me my kids. The problem is financial matters from a divorce, except for child support, cannot be revisited. Division of assets is done.
Yep.
And whereas custody can be revisited at any time, all you have to do is allege what's called a change in circumstances, and you can revisit the custody. And so women often face, where they give away the store to keep custody in a divorce from an abuser, is that suddenly 2, 3, 4 years later, now they're losing custody too, or they're being challenged for custody, only now they've got no money to fight it with because they gave all the money away, but he's got tons of money to fight it with. So even though I sympathize with that urge to give away the store to keep custody of the kids, don't do it, because then you might lose, then you need that money for the potential of a future custody battle.
Yeah.
And so that's one thing I would say. Another thing I would say is, it's hard to find a good lawyer for this particular kind of case. There can be lawyers who are very skilled lawyers who still don't really get how to handle this particular kind of case, where you're divorcing someone who's really out for revenge. And so keep looking, and don't just go, oh, someone says, oh, so-and-so's a great divorce lawyer. Well, a great divorce lawyer usually means they're great about assets. And it doesn't mean that they understand what it's like if you're divorcing someone who's really selfish and destructive. And so keep looking. And what you need is not a cutthroat. When you're angry, you think, oh,
You don't need another abusive
I
person.
need a lawyer who's going to go in there and blow the other parent away. Well, if you're someone who's hooked on a long-term divorce, that's what you're going to get. But if you really care about your kids, you don't want that to happen. And so what you need is a lawyer, and I acknowledge this is hard to find, but what you need is a lawyer who's tough as nails, in other words, who's absolutely got your back, but who doesn't look that way in court. Who in court sounds very calm, says, we want to work this out, let's negotiate this, let's negotiate that, but who doesn't pressure you to give up things you don't want to give up. So you start to sense that he or she really is out there for your interests. Again, I think particularly for women, this may happen for men sometimes too, but I find particularly for moms, they end up putting so much of their energy into fighting their own attorneys. And
I was just going to say that. I would say one of the biggest things is my spouse is a bully, so I'm going to go hire a bully attorney, and then I'm sandwiched between my attorney, who I'm arguing with or chasing or being disrespected by, and my spouse. And it's almost like, I can't believe I've stepped into something even more difficult and more painful than before I started the divorce. And I think that's what you're putting words to.
Absolutely. But you also have to be careful about getting an overly conciliatory lawyer, because then she starts to have to fight with her lawyer about that, because the lawyer's saying, give this up, give this up, give this up. And she's saying, my kids are not going to do well in this plan. And the lawyer says, oh, that's the best you're going to get, and is obviously not really willing to go to bat for her. There are such problems in the family court with the overlapping relationships. This lawyer also has a bunch of other cases in front of the same judge, and so he or she really wants to please the judge. There's a lot of problems you can't solve. But anyhow, do your best to find someone who, I had a very dear friend who went through a divorce with a really bad guy, and her fighting to save her daughter, whose boundaries were also being violated. And she found that this is sort of, in some ways, watching her case was how I learned what you really need. Because her lawyer looked so reasonable, would not participate in the inflammatory back and forth between the lawyers that they love to write their inflammatory letters back and forth to each other. She refused to participate in that, just absolutely stayed on task, but she really watched out for my friend. And you could tell she really had my friend's back. That if you're eligible for legal aid and legal aid is available where you live, get yourself a legal aid lawyer. And this is something that people are often reluctant to do because they think, oh, but they falsely equate legal aid with like a public defender and think, well, if I was accused of murder, I wouldn't want a public defender. And so I better not have a legal aid lawyer when I'm fighting for my kids. Well, legal aid isn't the same thing as a public defender, even though they are publicly funded. The legal aid lawyers, when it comes to divorcing a domestic abuse related divorce, are the best trained lawyers that I've ever encountered. They really understand the specific terrain of divorcing a domestic violence perpetrator. And it's not easy to find a lawyer who understands that specific terrain. So if you're eligible for legal aid,
Go for it.
go for it.
Yeah.
And then the last thing I'll say, I mean, I can talk longer, but it sounds like we're running out of time, is stay focused on having the highest quality of relationship that you have with your kids, that you can have with your kids. And if you're divorcing an abuser, that person is usually trying to damage your relationship with your kids. And so focus on having really good time with your kids. Don't be always so focused on your litigation that you're forgetting that the whole point of litigation is to be able to have good time with your kids. So you got to have good time with your kids. Work out your conflicts with them, to try to follow the old principle from hundreds of years ago of don't go to bed mad, and let your kids have a voice. Try to really hear what they have to say, but you're in charge. Don't stop being the mom who's in charge, but also make sure that your kids really get taken seriously and have a voice. Make room for their loving feelings towards their dad and for their bitterness towards their dad. And it's hard for moms to listen to either of those, right? It's hard to listen to their loving feelings towards dad because you feel like, oh my God, look what he did to me. And it's hard to listen to their bitterness towards dad because then right away you start to feel guilty, like, oh God, look what I've brought into their lives. And those kids need space from you for both of those. You don't have to overjoin with either of those. Just be there for those and understand them and say, please don't say he's a terrible person. That's not going to help.
I was just going to say, let's make sure you're not bashing the other parent.
That doesn't help. But just like, oh yeah, you have a right to be angry about that. Or yeah, he shouldn't have done that to you. They do need to have inappropriate behaviors named as inappropriate, and they do need to have boundary violations named as boundary violations, but just name the behavior as bad. He shouldn't do that, or that's not okay, or you have the right to have your door locked, or no one should be in the bathroom while you're in the bathroom, or no one should be in there while you're in the shower. Just name the behavior, but don't start speaking badly of the other parent as a person.
Wow.
And a bad ruling from the court doesn't mean automatically that your relationships with your children are necessarily going to go badly. It is a factor, but it's not automatic. And unfortunately, even a good ruling from the court doesn't guarantee that things will go well. So make your relationships with your kids your top priority. Read parenting books, watch parenting videos, respect your kids. If you have mental health issues, try to get help for your issues. If you've got addiction issues, try to get help for your issues. And let your kids care about both parents to the extent that can be safe. I'm not saying let them have tons of time with another unsafe parent, but respect their caring for that parent, and try to have the absolute best relationship you can with them.
Great tips, great suggestions. This has been incredible. Thank you so much for coming and sharing with us.
You're welcome, and I'm really sorry that your audience is having to go through the kinds of struggles that they have, and it's painful, and it's hard watching your kids go through such painful circumstances. When you're a really loving parent, that's a really hard thing.
It's such an excruciating stage of life for all of those reasons and all of the uncertainty on the other side. I know you've written a lot of books. I would love for you to mention whichever titles are aligned with what we talked about today. They'll be in the show notes for those of you listening. Go ahead.
And again, these are heavily are heavily written for women. So the sort of general understanding of abuse and how it functions in an intimate relationship is called Why Does He Do That? There's an article specifically about understanding, a book specifically about understanding what your kids go through and how you can help them with what they've gone through, called When Dad Hurts Mom. And then there's a book that's expensive because it's a professional book that's specifically about how this all relates to family law proceedings. And it can be helpful to a mom who's in litigation, but it can be particularly helpful to her lawyer. That's called The Batterer as Parent. And that's the only book that's cited. My other books are not cited. They're just trade books that don't have citations. So if you need to know the studies, then you need The Batterer as Parent. And get it at your library. You don't got to buy it. And then I have a couple of other resources, but they're much more in the healing direction. One is called Should I Stay or Should I Go? And one is just called Daily Wisdom for Why Does He Do That? Which is a devotional. It's 365 daily readings for abused women. And then I have a couple books that are almost separate from domestic violence. One is just a healing book for both men and women, by the way. If any of the men are just interested in a book about emotional healing in general, this book was written for everybody. That's simply called The Joyous Recovery. That's just about healing from emotional wounds in general. And then I have a novel, a mystery and suspense novel, but that one does touch back on what goes on in family law. And that novel is just called In Custody.
Your website is?
LundyBancroft.com. And then the healing website, which I'll also give you a link for, is peaklivingnetwork.org.
Yeah. So if you're on the subway or driving, just check out the show notes. You'll see a whole host of links. Are you on social media as well, Lundy?
Not much. I'm on Facebook, but I don't post often.
Okay. Okay. So we'll just look at him on his website and in his books. This has been just beautiful. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing. And thank you for what you've dedicated the last 3 decades of your life to do. It's so needed.
I hope it's made a contribution. There's so many people out there trying everything they can think of.
Yeah. Yeah. So we'll be back again real soon. You folks take care. Thanks for joining us on the Journey Beyond Divorce podcast. I hope you found guidance and encouragement to help you along your journey. If you like my podcast, please take a minute to subscribe and leave a review on iTunes. You can also visit us at jbddivorcesupport.com, where our team of coaches support both men and women through our one-on-one coaching, group programs, online courses, and free resources. Stay tuned for our next episode, and I'll talk to you soon.